Okay, so we're back at it today to continue this discovery into the Gillo GT, the 27-inch riser that I got my hands on. Thank you to a Patreon supporter of mine. And I am looking forward to digging into this riser some more to try to figure out more about the riser and some of the issues that I've been having, including not getting my limbs out of the bow after I align the bow, at least how I normally align this type of system. So we're going to continue following along and setting up this riser. I apologize for the delay, and I apologize for not being very thorough in my first part. To be honest, my phone died right when I cut it off before, and because this took a little bit longer than expected due to these issues that I'm finding. So if you haven't seen the first part yet, I'll recommend you check that out before you watch this video. Links in the description below, plus a card at the top here for part 1. And then after this video, I'll be doing some shooting and my thoughts and feelings on that as well. Again, very excited to be able to put my hands and shoot my very first bare bow riser, basically. For those of you that are new here, my name is Jake Kaminski. I'm a 2-time Olympic silver medalist in the sport of archery, and we're going to make this channel a great resource to all types of archery. So if you haven't yet, hit that subscription button and the notification bell. That way you're notified every time a new video is uploaded. I'd appreciate it. So, in a nutshell, what's going on is I'm having an issue with dealing with the alignment block here. And I do need to make a correction. The people at Gillo, Vittorio, let me know that this is actually 7075 anodized aluminum. This is not brass. Happy to see that. They say they save like 70 grams of weight per pocket, which is awesome. And I think they do offer brass versions or steel versions as an add-on and a replacement piece. So that's neat to see, because I think they offer it on their 19-inch riser or something like that. So I was mistaken. It is not brass. And I'm going to tear this apart today, and we're going to look at it a little bit more in depth and try to figure out what's going on, because a bit of information in their manual that I read, and what I thought I read was, you can have the 2 opposing grub screws that move this adjustment tight, to each other to make it prevent it from moving, and then you add the locking grub screws on the backside. Because as I shoot the Win and Wins and others, I've not had those issues where I couldn't not have it tight. And so I'm going to dig more into this and figure out why you can't get the limb out when it's too tight. I highly doubt it's from squeezing it in and bending it and locking the actual dovetail itself, because I didn't tighten them that tight. I just barely snugged them, at least to my standards. So I'm going to look into this a little bit more, because the alignment system, first you got to loosen this inner bolt here, this M6 inner lock, and they suggest a 1/4 turn loose, which I did exactly, 1/4 turn. And then the locking grub screws, you need to take the locking ones out and then put the limbs in, and you can adjust the grub screws. And down here, and I'll do a close-up so you guys can see it, on number 8, it says, when optimal alignment is reached, tighten the grub screw on the opposite side of the one operated last on that limb. Meaning, if I was pushing the limb this direction, after I'm done pushing it this direction, tighten the other side. Tighten the grub screw on the opposite side of the one operated last on that limb. And then insert and tighten the 2 grub screws, and you may need to add thread locker because they may vibrate loose, which is understandable. So it does, in their manual, say to tighten the 2 grub screws that hold the pivoting block. So I did that to my standard, and I can't get my limb out. So Gillo reached out to me and sent me an email. Specifically, it was Vittorio, and I saw some other people on my Patreon channel through Discord, the Discord server, comment and show some posts that they saw from like Archery Talk or from the Facebook Barebow group or whatever about this riser, and said basically, there's a discrepancy due to limb manufacturers and tolerances, and Gillo has a high standard for tolerances, which is amazing to see according to what the data they're giving us or giving the public, and they say it's just a limb manufacturer issue. Maybe true, maybe not true. I don't know. We're going to find out. I'll put different limbs in and see if it happens to every set of limb that I have here. and also they mentioned to not have the grub screws tight, but in their manual it says to have them tight. So you know, just my report, my feedback, I did it exactly how I thought I was doing it or supposed to be doing it, and lock the limbs in place. So I'll keep digging into it and we'll find out together here. I'm gonna take this block out and we're gonna see what's going on behind here and the alignment system. I will put close-ups of everything that I'm finding in this video so you guys can check it out as I'm figuring it out as well. Because I think it's important to be able to see these things firsthand. And either way, it's a bit of discovery, and I think it's pretty fun as well to be able to put my hands on this stuff and learn and find out things along with you guys. Alright, so I got it clamped in the vise here. So this is just a basic countersink style head. Alright, so inside of this here, this is the 7075 aluminum adjuster, and what I had a theory of was that there was maybe some sort of slope on these surfaces where the grub screws come into contact here, and what I was thinking was it kind of pushes this block out away from the riser as I tighten it. So we're going to do some close-ups and get an idea of what's going on here and try to figure this out. But what is interesting is behind this little block, there's a little recessed machined hole, and then they have this kind of like a spring flat washer that's wavy. So it's built and designed to keep tension and outward tension onto this, just to kind of help things from vibrating loose. And also when you're loosening it up, it keeps the surface nice and flat and doesn't wobble off to the sides. You know, it's a pretty basic setup and a pretty basic system, and due to the design of this, I mean, I would be impressed if my level of tightness that I did squeezed this down, because I just don't see really any sort of issues, damage, dings inside that show that this dovetail was actually stuck inside. And I don't see this being too much of an issue. So let's see how it fits in the limb itself and what it looks like. I mean, the tolerances are very good. There's very, very little play at all within the dovetail system inside their slot. So what it appears happens, and this is going to be a total guess, that when this gets tightened by the grub screws, what happens is this pitches one direction or the other too much. So much so that due to the tolerances that are from this surface of the limb, meaning right here, these flat surfaces where the backside of the limb sets against the riser, and the depth of this that limits how high up the limb can go, because when you snap this in place, if you look closely inside of here, you'll see that where the dovetail sits inside of here, its left to right alignment is actually the flat spot of the dovetail that's pretty far up towards the limb. And then the vertical height is limited. Well, it's the detent is pushing down, so then the cone area of the actual dovetail pushes and butts up against the cone area of this actual adjuster block. So what my theory is that the tolerances here to the depth of here are so tight that when you tighten this, when the screw here is slightly loose, it cocks it sideways and then jams the limb into the system, because then now you can't pull it out due to friction. So we're going to test here, and I'm going to lock this down and leave it tight, or mostly tight, good and snug, but not tight, and then do the adjustment and see if the limbs will still stay in, because then it will still keep this nice and flat against that surface and not allow it to pop out with that spring behind it. And then I'll probably try taking the spring out and do the adjustment, leave it tight, and see if I can get the limb out, because maybe it's that little spring that's cocking this thing sideways and not actually the grub screws. So we'll play with it a couple of different ways and see what happens. So first I'm going to do it without the spring washer. I got it tight, all right, and then I'm going to give it the quarter turn that they recommend. We'll put the limb in. Okay, the limb went in and it should come out because everything's loose. Yep. Now I'm going to snug it the same amount of snugness that I did before. Alright, so that's about the same amount of snugness that I did before. And maybe too tight, but I can get it out. So that's pretty tight and it comes in and out. I wouldn't say that it's too tight or too loose. It's a little stiff, but I'd rather have it tighter than looser just due to tolerances. And what I can feel is if I take my finger and I rub from this surface to the adjuster and then compare this side, it's not centered because of the adjustment's off. So I'm going to recenter it and see. But what I can feel right now is this side is much, like it's way elevated this way compared to this side. This side's much more flush, this side's elevated. So I bet you I'm right. Yeah, so after I have it recentered, I can feel that it's elevated here compared to this side. So much so that I can actually see it. So I'm going to show you. So if you look to the left side, you'll see that the bushing is protruding further from the limb pocket than the right side. And that is definitely going to cause the limb to bind and not want to come out nice. So I'm going to put the spring back in. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to loosen up the adjustment again and then tighten that the 6mm screw down more than that quarter turn. Just give it a good snug, not tight. Give it good snug. And then I'm going to tighten these back up, the grub screws, and see if that change, that discrepancy that I'm feeling goes away. So again, same tightness. Probably should have tried it with the limb in because I can't get it out now. All right, with them loose, you can get the limb out. With it snug, you can still get the limb out. And now that it's tight here, or snug here, I feel no difference in the depth. It feels much better. I still think that this surface is a little bit too proud. It's too tall. If that was a little shorter, this wouldn't be binding as much. So we'll put the washer back in underneath and do that same test real quick. All right, so this is snug. Now we're gonna do a quarter turn. I gave it plenty of loose just so I could get it out easily. Alright, so I'm going to show you a close-up here because there's something happening that I thought might be happening. As I just barely touch these grub screws, obviously the limb's not in, but the aluminum piece inside of here is shifting as I'm just barely tightening and snugging this up. So that could be part of the reason why things shift and then you can't get your limb out. It just could be a possibility. Now obviously there's no limb in this, but it definitely shifts a whole lot. Put the limb in with the adjusters loose, snug it back up. Now this is with that quarter turn into that M6 bolt. I can get it out now. Loosen it up. I'm going to do a minor shift. Snug. Just snug. I can get it out again. It's getting tight though. And this is, I'm doing the same tightness that I normally would do on my win and win adjustment. Like, I'm making sure that there's enough firm contact of the grub screws to make sure that that block doesn't shift when I have them just barely touching when I then go to do the alignment correctly. And now I can't get the limb out. Again. Snug. I can get it out. It's inconsistent to me in my findings thus far. Give it a little more. I can still get it out, but something that I'm noticing that I didn't have before is some wear here on the limb from putting it in and out. You can see how tight the tolerance is here due to the wear marks and the wear patterns. And these were brand new limbs basically. I shot them out of my win and win, the 2 win and wins that I have, the new ones, and they didn't have these wear marks. And I can definitely tell they're from the Gillo because in here on this surface here where the dovetail slides in is not radiused at all. And on this side, or chamfered, or whatever you want to call it, on this side of the pocket, it's chamfered, so it's not sharp. But on the inside here, it's not chamfered, or it is chamfered here, it is not chamfered here, and so it's very sharp. And that's digging into the limb. You know, I can understand the scuffing due to the tight tolerances, but that inside channel where the dovetail slides in isn't chamfered at all. I think it'd be worth the extra process in the machinery to chamfer that edge a little bit, since they already did this one right here. Might as well do that one there too. It would wear the limbs out a little bit less. So now that I tried it with this a quarter turn loose, like they suggest in the manual, I'm going to tighten it back up and adjust it snug and see if I can get my limbs out a bit more consistently. So I'm snug now, past that quarter turn, and let's see. So with it finger tight and not that quarter turn loose, I can still shift the block left and right. And Gillo also suggested trying this, not loosening this bolt and shifting the limbs left and right. I think that you're better off at home if you have one of these risers or are going to pick one of these risers up. Don't loosen that bolt a quarter turn. That's going to be part of your problem of not being able to get your limbs out, because it is cocking. Like I said, I believe that the tolerances here are just too tight in between the dovetail and the backside of the limb, you know, tolerances and measurement, that's where the limb itself, like if this is the surface of the limb and this is the limiting up factor of the actual dovetail, when it's in its receiver, it can't go up anymore this way, and the limb itself is actually touching the riser like this. So it's just when you go to tighten it, this cocks and it binds in here, and now you can't get the limb out. So if you leave this screw here tight, mostly tight, it's not going to do this, and then your limbs won't bind and you can get your limbs out and still have the adjusters and the grub screws to a reasonable level of tightness, which will really help prevent stuff from vibrating loose. Yes, they tell you to use Loctite to make sure that things don't vibrate loose, but if you're just barely touching the surfaces of stuff and then you lock something behind it, of course it's going to vibrate loose because you're only really tight on one side. You know, I think having a tight in the inside and then locked on the outside with Loctite will be better off in the long run, and I think more accurate in my opinion too. At least more accurate in setup. So the grub screws are loose now. We'll put the limb in. We will do our adjustment. I'll visually just center it. It's snug now, the exact same snugness that I've been doing. Well, I can barely get the limb out. So it's pretty tight. Play with it some more. So I just had it just touching, just barely touching, not tight, not snug, nothing. Limb comes out, great. Let's see if it's tight enough to prevent movement of the actual bolt. All right, with this M6 bolt tight and these adjusters just touching, I have no play. I cannot move this in any direction at all. There's no adjustment, no play, no nothing. I'm going to loosen this back up, do a quarter turn on this from tight. All right, so I'm going to do a quarter turn loose like they suggest. Have that just barely touching. Okay, and there's no looseness, no play, no nothing, which is good to see. I'm going to put the limb in and do an adjustment. Have it just barely touching like they recommend. Pull the limb out, which it comes out. Excellent. No movement. So just doing it just tight probably be okay. I would imagine that as you tighten these grub screws in, that nothing shifts and moves. I would at least hope not. But I can tell you for sure, just now, putting the tightening grub screw in without these adjusters tight, if I hold my finger on this, because I don't have a micrometer on it, so if I have my finger sitting on the black surface and the gold surface, like this, as I tighten and loosen this grub screw, the locking grub screw, not the adjustment grub screw, I can feel this 7075 anodized gold plate shift out from the riser. See if I can actually see it. I can't see it shift, so I can feel it though, 100%. So what I'm going to suggest here I'm going to put this other side in and see if snugging the other side at the same time will prevent that movement from happening. Alright, so we're going to try to see if we can get this on camera. Because as I'm tightening the grub screw, the interlocking screws are absolutely rotating. So if you do not tighten them evenly, the locking grub screws on the outside of the adjuster grub screws, your alignment is changing as you tighten these locking grub screws down. So we'll see if I can get this on camera. But we're going to shift the alignment all the way to one side so we can see as much of the threads of the adjustment as possible. So the locking grub screws and the adjustment grub screws are the exact same grub screws. Alright, so I'm going to bring the camera close. And what I want you to look for is in here. You can see I have this Allen wrench attached and you can see that rotation happening, right? This side, I'm going to put in an Allen wrench and I'm just going to hold it and just snug this side up like they suggest, just touching it. Just like that, not tight. And I will take a grub screw, another one, and I will take one for this side, and I will also put one in the other side. I'm just going to touch them. That's not going to be tight yet. Just touch it. Okay? So that's just touching. It's not tight. Now I'm going to switch to here. This Allen side, this Allen side. And I'll tighten one. I'll tighten this side first. Watch that grub screw. See it moving as I'm tightening it? And now I'll do both sides at the same time and still watch that screw. It's loose, it's moving. It's totally moving. So it is absolutely moving the adjustment of the limb when you tighten those locking grub screws, when you do not have the inner adjustable grub screws snug or tight against the adjustment block. So if I loosen and take those adjusters back out, and then I'm going to loosen the adjustment system, and I'm going to leave it adjusted off to one side because I want, if I see no movement, I'll prove it to you guys. So I'm going to snug this back up. It's not tight, just snug. Tighten the grub screws, the adjustment grub screws, like I would prefer to do. And I'm going to tighten them to my level, not just snug, but tight. Okay, they're tight to my standard. That's how I would tighten them before I were to lock any limb bolts in place. Put that grub screw in. Put this one in. Now I'm going to tighten them. And just as I suspected, with the inner adjusters tight, the outer locks do not move the adjusters. I'm going to show you up close and so you can see it for yourself. Alright, so I have the grub screws, the locking grub screws loose. You look in here again, let me turn the brightness up on the lights, and I go to tighten it. It doesn't shift. You see that? In there. It's not moving at all. So when the inner ones are tight, as you lock the locks, it does not move the inner ones at all. So what would I do about this? I would work on playing with some tolerances within the riser itself. I'm not the manufacturer, so I can't do that. So as a consumer, what I would tell you guys at home is to leave this screw here, this locking screw, leave it basically tight and snug up the adjustment screws as much as you possibly can without locking that limb in. Check it for tightness. Get it to not lock it in place, and then run your locking grub screws in tight with Loctite so they don't move, and call it a day. So the adjustment system on this is pretty nice, and I like the movement on it. Obviously we're having some issues with some tolerances, and saying that it's not your limbs, therefore potentially not much of your problem, is a bit of an issue in my opinion, because like I said, not everybody uses the same limbs. Even in the same manual they say, hey, if you're going to use different limbs, try different brace heights. I think that's great. That is a great step forward for the archery community and the archery industry to encourage people to essentially try other manufacturers on your manufacturing riser. Totally great. I like that. I can respect that. But this being a bit too tight and saying our tolerances are great and best out there, that's excellent. I'm glad they are, but we're definitely seeing some issues here. So we need to have some sort of adjustment in the system to be able to not lock everything in place, because, well, we need to take our limbs out of our risers, but also the adjusters moving as you're tightening the grub screws is a problem to me. And if you're having that problem at home, I would suggest tightening both grub screws on the opposite sides at the same time. Cinch them down together, so hopefully those inner screws will adjust and move that same amount equally that the outer screws are, or at least equally left to right, so then you're not, losing your setting for your limb alignment. At worst case scenario, check your alignment after you put the locking grub screws in and they're tight. And as long as your alignment hasn't shifted and changed and moved, then excellent. Good news for everybody. So I'm going to put the locks back in, readjust the alignment on the bow itself, and get it back to being centered. And then we're going to take this bow through the bow weight adjustment range and see what we can come up with as far as any alignment changes throughout the actual limb weight change itself. And I will also measure the actual true adjustment range on limbs and see if they're plus or minus 15% or 30% or whatever it is. We'll figure it out what they mean by a 30% limb weight adjustment. I would assume that's plus or minus 15% of whatever it is in the middle. So we'll take it through its extremes of adjustments and see if it maintains alignment and see what happens with the actual weight itself. Okay, so I have the limbs aligned back to where they were, how I like them. The inner screw, the 6mm screw, is tight, and then the adjusters, I'm gonna snug them up now equally, both sides together. The inner adjusters, I'm gonna unstring the bow, and then I'm going to verify that I can take the limbs in and out. And if I can, then I'm going to lock the locking grub screws and check my alignment again just to make sure and call it a day. So I'm happy with that. So I'm going to unstring it and check the limb's ability to come in and out, and then tighten those grub screws and call it good. So far, I mean, if the limbs themselves didn't lock in place, it would be super easy and straightforward, and I wouldn't have had any sort of delay, and this would have been aligned extremely quickly. But due to this issue right here, not being able to get the limbs out comfortably, it makes it a bit challenging. So I can get that limb out, and like I said, I'd rather have it snug than not. So I'm going to lock those grub screws in the upper, and I'm going to tighten them like I would tighten them finally, nice and snug, unable to come loose. Alright, so I couldn't get it out with the grub screws tight, the locking grub screws, with the inners snug. Let's see if they're still snug, the inners, and they're not because it got stuck to the grub screws, the outers. Snug it back up. Alright, I can get the limbs in and out. Lock the locking grub screws, snug. Can't get him out. Okay, so the upper limb, the locking grub screws, I got them as tight as I dare I do without the limb potentially becoming stuck. So we're gonna call it good. I can see why Loctite is required, because if I tighten them tight so I know they're not gonna loosen, I can't get the limb out. I wish it was different, and I wish I could report something different, but I just can't. Okay, the bottom one is good, so I'm going to lock the locking grub screws. Excuse me, I snugged the adjustment grub screws. So now I'm going to lock the lock grub screws. I do not have blue Loctite, I only have red Loctite, and that's the permanent kind. So because this is not my riser, I will not be using permanent Loctite, because if somebody needs to adjust their limbs again, that would be a tragedy. And I'm not going to do that to that person. So I'm going to snug them as tight as I dare snug them, and hopefully I'll be able to get the limb out. So with the limb in, the amount of tightness I would normally tighten it, and Can't get it out. So I'm gonna guess that my limbs have shifted because I tried locking the lock rub screws as snug as I would snug them, and it locks the limb in place. So when I crack the locking grub screws free, it seems to want to extract the inners as well. So it loosens those up. So I've snugged them back down, and I'm hoping that it won't affect the adjustment all that much or the alignment all that much. And I'm gonna give it as snug as I can and still get this limb out, so I can at least get to shooting this thing. All right, I can get the top and the bottom limb bolt out, or top and bottom limb out. I will, let's see, check to see the locking grubs for the bow weight is not in place, so that's good. I'll be able to adjust that. We'll take it through the range of motion. Once I get a base scale at their stock setting, which I believe they claim is a 15-degree limb pocket setting, and we'll take the weight there, take it through a range of a bow weight, and see what it does, see if the alignment changes at all, too. Okay, so I haven't touched anything on the adjustment of the alignment limb system here. Just putting the biter blocks back on to verify that things are still straight after snugging up the lock screws for the limb adjusters. And unfortunately it shifted the limbs a little bit, so due to the level of straightness that I look for, I'm gonna do it again. Okay, so I have the limbs aligned again, and I have the locking grub screws locked, and in order for, I need to tie a knocking point on really quick, but I want to see if I can get the limbs out. So, Alright, so now I had to do it again, and I have the inners just touching like I was suggested to by Gillo. Trying to do it in a way that I would see to my level of confidence that this would stay aligned and correct. It is now just barely touching. I bet you I could blow on it and it might want to loosen up, but it's as loose as I'm comfortable having it touch, which is just barely touching. So I'm gonna put these grub screws back in, tighten them, and hopefully I'll be able to get my limbs out. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider hitting the like button, the subscription button, and the notification bell. And if you're interested in supporting my channel, head to my website, Kaminski.com, where you can find information on Patreon, apparel, books, and digital coaching as well.